History books tell us about kings' wars, conquests, and magnificent coronation ceremonies. But when the palace doors closed, who was with those kings in their most intimate moments? The generals? No. The queens? No. In that room, when the king was at his most vulnerable and most human, while relieving himself, there was only one man beside him: the groom of the stool. In crude terms, the servant of the stool. These men's job was, quite literally, to take care of the king's cleanliness. Yes, including wiping his bottom. But don't turn up your nose, because this dirty job was one of the most coveted, most prestigious positions in English history. A role for which murders were committed and bribes were paid. But why? Why would a duke beg for the chance to clean another man's toilet? In this video, we dive into the foul-smelling yet power-whispering true history hidden in the corridors of the palace. Behold, the story of the toilet attendants who helped rule an empire. It must be explained that defecation was not considered a private, hidden, and shameful act as it is in the modern world, but rather a public, ritualistic, and medical display of power for kings. Without establishing this context, the prestige of the role cannot be understood. Tudor-era political philosophy and legal theory argued that the king was not a single being, but possessed two separate bodies. This theory, detailed in Ernst Kantorowicz's classic work, is the very foundation of the groom of the stool. Body natural. The king's mortal, physical body that becomes ill, ages, gets hungry, and needs to relieve itself. This body is flawed and subject to the laws of nature just like any other person. Body politic. The king's immortal, infallible, invisible, and fundamentally state-like spiritual body. This body never ages, never gets sick, and never dies. The king is dead, long live the king, expresses this continuity. This is a critical metaphor for explaining why the groom of the stool was not merely a simple servant. While an ordinary courtier served the king's political body, his crown, scepter, and decrees, the groom of the stool served the king's natural body. But here lies the paradox. When the king was on the toilet, bathing or dressing, he set aside his crown and scepter. In other words, his political body temporarily receded into the background. The person beside him in that moment was the only one who had access to the king at his most vulnerable, most naked, and most human state. This access was far more powerful than formal council meetings, parliamentary sessions, or diplomatic audiences, because it existed in a moment of nakedness, devoid of protocol and hierarchy. He who commanded the king's natural body could also influence his political body. For the modern audience, the hardest part to understand is that privacy was not a luxury, but a sign of loneliness, and therefore, powerlessness. To be a king in the 16th century meant never being alone. Solitude was dangerous for a ruler. It meant risk of assassination. It meant having no witnesses. For this reason, even the king's most intimate moments were crowded. The king's defecation was the primary indicator of his health. Tudor medicine had no blood tests or MRIs. Urine and stool analysis, uroscopy, and fecal examination were the basis of diagnosis. The king's health was the health of the state, body politic. Therefore, examining the king's stool, analyzing its smell, checking its consistency and color, was not a disgusting cleaning duty for a doctor or servant, but a vital intelligence operation, like forecasting the state's future, tracking the stock market, or receiving a national security briefing. In the video, this can be presented as the historical equivalent of modern medical checkups and top-secret governmental health reports. The phrase, "the king being constipated was a national security issue," is a powerful narrative tool that captures the essence of the situation. Among historians, there is no complete consensus on this subject, and the frequency or necessity of the actual wiping varied by period. Popular culture and misconceptions. In series like The Tudors, or comedies like Blackadder, these men are portrayed directly and constantly performing the wiping. This aligns with the modern audience's perception of servitude. Historical evidence and David Starkey's analysis. David Starkey, a leading Tudor historian, confirms that the role did involve attending to the king's most intimate physical needs, but emphasizes that this did not always necessarily mean personally doing the wiping. The role is defined with the verb assist, meaning to help. This assistance included preparing water, towels, and a basin, collecting the king's clothes, helping him sit or stand, and providing the necessary materials for his cleaning. Primary source analysis. The Book of Nurture, 1452, poetically describes the duties of a chamberlain, chamber servant. In the video, this text should be shown and read aloud. See the privy house for easement be fair, sweet, and clean, and the whole himself, look there no board be seen. Look there be blanket, cotton, or linen to wipe the nether end. Make sure the privy is clean and sweet-smelling. Ensure no boards are visible in the hole. Have a blanket, cotton, or linen ready to wipe the lower end. This source clearly commands that the materials be prepared. Look there be. But it does not definitively prove that the servant carried out the wiping himself. A more likely scenario is that the king wiped himself, while the groom held and prepared the materials. Exceptions and nuances. When the king was ill, elderly, or extremely overweight, for example, in the final years of Henry VIII's life, when he could not move due to leg ulcers and extreme obesity, the scope of assistance would inevitably expand into physical contact and direct cleaning a hole in it. It was one of the most expensive, ornate, and technologically advanced pieces of furniture of its time. The video should include a detailed visual reconstruction of this object. Design and materials. According to the records of Hampton Court Palace and surviving museum examples, these stools were typically covered in crimson velvet. Velvet was a fabric reserved for royalty. The seat was soft, stuffed with feathers or wool. Its edges were decorated with silk fringes, gilt nails, gold-plated tacks, and ribbons. Internal mechanism. Inside the wooden box was a removable chamber, pan, basin, usually made of pewter or sometimes copper. After use, this chamber was emptied and cleaned by lower-ranking servants, yeomen of the stool. The groom of the stool did not do the emptying. He attended solely to the king. Portability and logistics. Wherever the king went, hunting trips, battlefields, travels between palaces, this stool went with him. One of the groom's primary logistical duties was to protect, transport, and keep this valuable piece of furniture always ready for use, clean and odorless. Even in war, the king's comfort depended on this object. Cleaning materials. The materials used for the royal posterior were not the leaves, straw, or moss used by common peasants of the era. Instead, fine linen cloths, wool patches, and sometimes natural sponges soaked in warm water were used. Water, a basin, and towels, ewer and basin, were integral to the process. Rose water was also commonly used to mask odors. The role of the groom of the stool expanded dramatically during the reigns of Henry VII and especially Henry VIII, evolving from a simple servant position into one of the most crucial bureaucratic offices of the state. Hygiene officer. The basic duty was to assist the king with toilet needs, bathing, dressing, and undressing. Confidant and therapist. When the king was at the stool, no one else was present. Guards waited outside. This was a moment when the king was vulnerable and let his guard down. For a servant, there was no better opportunity to make a request of the king, share gossip, malign a rival, or influence the signing of a bill. Keeper of the privy purse. This was the most critical transformation of the role. From the time of Henry VII, the king's personal expenditures, gambling debts, jewels for mistresses, alms, and secret payments were managed by these individuals. The king did not deal with the exchequer for such funds. He used the money from his privy purse. The groom who managed this money effectively became the state's shadow chancellor. Figures like Hugh Dennis and William Compton influenced national financial policies through this role. Gatekeeper. They also decided who could enter the king's privy chamber. An ambassador, a minister, or a duke who wanted to see the king first had to satisfy the toilet attendant. Without their approval, access to the king's private quarters was impossible. The most striking and dramatic part of the video will be the biographies of those who held this role. These individuals were not mere servants or valets. They were sons of the noblest families of the era, knights, and political geniuses. Each of them, through this disgusting job, helped shape the fate of the empire. Sir William Compton, the first superstar and the king's shadow. Period. The early years of Henry VIII's reign, 1509 to 1526. Relationship. Henry VIII's childhood friend, at his side since the age of 11. They were almost like brothers. When Henry ascended the throne, one of his first acts was to appoint Compton as Groom of the Stool. Earnings and wealth. The king granted Compton so much land, titles, castle stewardship, and offices that his annual income reached approximately £2,000, equivalent to the income of England's richest dukes or bishops at the time. That a simple groom could become as wealthy as a duke caused immense jealousy and scandal at court. Compton used his wealth to transform the family estate, Compton Wynyates, into a magnificent Tudor mansion. Scandal and mistress network. Compton's duties went beyond the toilet. He also managed Henry VIII's love life. He arranged the king's mistresses, such as Bessie Blount. He himself allegedly had a forbidden affair with Lady Anne Hastings, rumored to be one of Henry's former mistresses and the sister of the Duke of Buckingham. This relationship caused a major crisis at court. The Duke of Buckingham fought Compton to defend his sister's honor, but King Henry defended his toilet attendant instead. This incident demonstrated that Compton's power exceeded even noble blood. End. When he died in 1528 from the sweating sickness, King Henry was deeply grieved. Sir Henry Norris, Dead Men's Shoes, and Loyalty Leading to Suicide. Period. The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, 1526 to 1536. Personality and role. Known as the gentlest man at court, Norris was one of the strongest supporters of the Anne Boleyn faction. He knew the king's most intimate secrets and controlled the privy purse. He played a key role in Anne Boleyn becoming queen. Downfall and Dead Men's Shoes. During Anne Boleyn's fall, Norris was accused of committing adultery with the queen. Yet what ultimately condemned him was not proof of adultery, but a dangerous conversation he had with Anne. In the video, this dialogue should be reenacted. Anne Boleyn asks Norris why he has not yet married. Norris replies, "I shall wait a little longer. Anne, angry, delivers the fatal line, "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me." Meaning, you are waiting for a dead man's shoes, my place. If anything were to happen to the king, you would aim to take me. This statement constitutes treason. Under the 1534 Treason Act, imagining, wishing, or verbally expressing the king's death was a capital offense. By saying this, Anne Boleyn inadvertently implicated both herself and Norris. End. King Henry personally interrogated Norris and offered to spare his life if he confessed and implicated the Queen. This was the greatest favor a king could grant a servant and demonstrated their closeness. However, Norris chose an honorable stance, stating that he believed in the Queen's innocence and would rather die 1,000 times than accuse her. On May 17, 1536, he was beheaded at Tower Hill. This is the most tragic example of the high risk of being a groom and the perilous proximity to the king's body. A dedicated section should be allocated to the 1526 Eltham Ordinances to explain the institutional structure and power struggles. While it appears to be a palace reform, it was in fact a political coup attempt. Cardinal Wolsey versus the Minions. Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful man of the period, was disturbed by the influence of these young, effective, and king-adjacent men in the royal bedroom, grooms and gentlemen of the Privy Chamber. He derisively called them minions. While Wolsey had to make appointments to reach the king, these men were with the king at the toilet, in bed, and on hunts. Purpose of the reform. Wolsey drafted the ordinances under the pretext of cutting palace expenses and removing rascals and vagabonds surrounding the king. His real goal was to reduce the Privy Chamber staff, remove powerful figures like William Compton from court, and fill the king's circle with his own loyal men. Outcome. Although Wolsey appeared successful on paper, he failed in practice. The king's intimate servants acted as a personal shield against Wolsey's bureaucratic power. Henry did not abandon his friends. This section is perfect for illustrating the conflict between the institutional state, Wolsey, council, and the personal monarchy, king, Privy Chamber. As a historical paradox and sociological analysis, the video should explain how female monarchs at the end of the Tudor dynasty, Mary I, Elizabeth I, transformed this role. The gender of privacy. According to 16th century moral norms, it was inconceivable for a man to enter the Queen's toilet, bedroom, or assist her while dressing. Therefore, when Mary I and Elizabeth I ascended the throne, the groom of the stool position was technically abolished, or suspended, for men. New titles. The male groom was replaced by positions such as Chief Gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber or Lady of the Bedchamber. For example, during Elizabeth I's reign, Cat Ashley was the Queen's closest confidant and effectively her toilet attendant. Loss of power? Figures like Cat Ashley and later Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, during Queen Anne's reign, wielded enormous emotional and political influence over the Queen. However, they never had the same institutionalized administrative power that male grooms held, such as official control of the privy purse or influence over fiscal policies. While women were formally excluded from official political office, their informal power, soft power, reached its peak. Sarah Churchill was, in effect, the real power behind Queen Anne. Sir Anthony Denny, the man who stood in for the king, and the dry stamp coup.
Period. The final years of Henry VIII.
1546 to 1547.
Power.
Henry was old, sick, immobile from obesity, and increasingly paranoid. His leg ulcers emitted a foul odor. While courtiers kept their distance, Denny remained by the king's side. He cleaned the king's bottom, tended to his wounds, and helped distract him from his pain.
Dry stamp mechanism.
The king's hands were so swollen, or perhaps due to laziness, that signing documents became difficult. Denny, along with his brother-in-law John Gates, was granted authority to use the dry stamp. This was a wooden template of the king's signature. When pressed onto paper, it left an embossed imprint, which was then inked. This was not a forgery tool, but an official delegation of authority. In practice, however, it allowed Denny to sign documents without the king's presence, or while the king was asleep or ill, effectively acting in the king's name.
A move that changed history.
As Henry neared death in 1547, Denny used the stamp to alter or update the king's will. The changes reshaped the Regency Council for the heir, Edward VI. The Catholic faction, Gardiner and the Duke of Norfolk, was sidelined, while the reformist Protestant faction, Edward Seymour, rose to power. England's future as a Protestant nation was largely secured thanks to Denny's intimate influence in the toilet and bedchamber, coupled with his use of the dry stamp. Denny was also the only person brave enough to inform the king that he was dying.
Legacy.
Today, the British royal family has no such title. However, roles like private secretary and keeper of the privy purse are the modern, hygienic, and bureaucratic descendants of the Groom of the Stool. This strange profession lasted for centuries, but when a queen, Elizabeth I, took the throne, things changed. It was considered inappropriate for a male servant to enter the queen's private chambers. Therefore, the role was taken over by the ladies of the bedchamber. However, its political influence diminished. Officially, this title was completely abolished in 1901, when Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII, ascended the throne. Victorian morality deemed such a role shameful. Over time, the name was even changed to Groom of the Stool, robe attendant, effectively cleaning up history a bit. Looking at it today, cleaning a king's toilet may seem humiliating, but in Tudor England, it was a key to power. These men, walking the fine line between excrement and diplomacy, shaped the course of history. See you in the next video, from the back rooms of history. The video should summarize how this peculiar institution came to an end, and what it left for the modern world. Stuart period and name change. When James I ascended the throne in 1603, the male Groom returned. However, over time, the title changed from Groom of the Stool to Groom of the Stole. The word stole is derived from the Latin stola, a long garment, deliberately shifting the association away from the shameful connection to excrement, stool. The role evolved from toilet cleaning to assisting with dressing the monarch and holding robes. Victorian era. During Queen Victoria's reign, her husband, Prince Albert, had his own attendants, but the role had become purely ceremonial. Abolition, 1901. When King Edward VII ascended the throne in 1901, the position was entirely abolished. Modernity, improved hygiene, the advent of plumbing in palaces, and changing perceptions of privacy, the Victorian morality, made having someone wipe the king's backside or carry his toilet necessities no longer an honor, but rather an embarrassing and obsolete tradition. Legacy. Today, the British royal family has no such title. However, roles like private secretary and keeper of the privy purse are the modern, hygienic, and bureaucratic descendants of the Groom of the Stool. This strange profession lasted for centuries, but when a queen, Elizabeth I, took the throne, things changed. It was considered inappropriate for a male servant to enter the queen's private chambers. Therefore, the role was taken over by the ladies of the bedchamber. However, its political influence diminished. Officially, this title was completely abolished in 1901 when Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII, ascended the throne. Victorian morality deemed such a role shameful. Over time, the name was even changed to Groom of the Stool, robe attendant, effectively cleaning up history a bit. Looking at it today, cleaning a king's toilet may seem humiliating, but in Tudor England, it was a key to power. These men, walking the fine line between excrement and diplomacy, shaped the course of history. See you in the next video, from the back rooms of history.